today to have AvidXchange with us. They're going to show how companies are transforming their AP processes, from eliminating manual entry to speeding up approvals and payments. Their platform is built to save time and reduce headaches. Wouldn't we all love that? I'm going to pass it over to Jim, my AvidXchange guru, so you guys can see all that in action. Thank you, Jim.
All right, thanks, Kate. Just to double confirm, you can see my screen okay?
Yes, I can.
All right, thank you. All right, yes, good morning, everyone. I'm Jim Talbot. I'm with AvidXchange. I'm an account rep. I'm going to take you through the AvidXchange AP automation system. As far as topics today, I'll start out by saying I don't plan on taking up the whole hour, probably 45 minutes. So, I'll give you a little bit of your day back. But as far as topics for the meeting, I'm going to just start with a few tips that might be useful, to determine if AP automation fits your business. If you're on the fence about whether you need AP automation or not, these may be useful. And then we'll go into an overview of how the TimberScan AP automation solution for Sage 300 works, and then jump into a product demo. And then same for the payment piece. For any of you companies looking to get away from printing paper checks, maybe offer your vendors and subs more payment options, some electronic options as well. I'll show you how that works to automate the whole AP automation process from invoice to payment. All right, as far as these tips, I don't plan on reading each of these. I don't want to bore you by reading slides here. You can see what's on the screen. This is being recorded. We can also provide copies as well. But just to highlight a few items, is AP automation a good fit for your company today? Maybe the volume of invoices you're getting is, fairly low and you're managing okay, but perhaps you have a large project that's starting up soon. That might be a reason you need AP automation. Or maybe a lot of smaller jobs, but they're cost plus or, T&M, GMP type projects where you need to supply copies of your vendor and sub invoices when you go to bill your customer. So AP automation systems will have an automated way to do that, to gather that up in a timely fashion. So you're not scrambling each month to try to make copies of, all your invoices for a certain project. How will the AP automation system work with your current accounting system? Well, you want to make sure it's fully integrated with Sage 300 CRE. You want to make sure you don't have to move data back and forth between the two systems, that happens for you automatically. You don't want to automate AP and wind up making, additional work for yourself. So, just a few things to consider there. As far as choosing the right provider, well, a number of items you want to look at as well. Data validation is important. You want to make sure the system is grabbing information from Sage as far as, the accounting period, for example, and it validates that period is open. You don't want the system pushing invoices into a closed period or letting, people approve invoices that are, for closed months, and also provide a way, when you do have invoices that cross over multiple months, if, invoices, for example, in March haven't been approved yet, and you've already closed the March fiscal period in Sage, is there an easy way to go ahead and change the fiscal date on those invoices from March to April? Cost is always important. You want to make sure you're getting a system with no hidden costs. Does it include, any OCR AI capabilities? Will it work with all your Sage data folders? If you have multiple companies, multiple data folders, is there an extra charge to use that product with any and all of your Sage data folders? And then finally, making sure you're getting the most out of your investment. I'll focus on this first one, the API integration capabilities. API just stands for Application Programmers Interface, and that just means when the AP automation system is installed, does it use API, which allows data to flow back and forth between the two systems seamlessly without you having to do anything? All right. All right, with that being said, I'll move on to the overview of invoice automation workflow. Again, our product is called TimberScan. It was designed specifically for Sage 300 CRE. So for anyone that's been using Sage 300 CRE for a long time, you'll know way back when it used to be called Timberline. And I still call it Timberline sometimes. I'm guilty of that. But that's actually where the TimberScan name came from. So it's been around almost 20 years now, designed specifically for Sage 300 CRE. Data flows seamlessly back and forth between the two systems. We store a copy of the invoice itself in the Sage database. It works with any and all of your data folders, and I'll go through the details soon during the live demonstration. Just as far as the flow, I did want to touch on these items. There can be up to 5 or 6 steps to get an invoice through the process, meaning to get it into TimberScan and then over to Sage 300. You certainly don't have to use all of these steps. And we'll try to automate some of these along the way. But just to talk about them a little bit, the first step is the acquire step. Normally, as far as the intake, the easiest way clients get their invoices into our system is via email. So if you have an email address you've given to the vendors and subs where you'd like them to submit invoices, then all we'll do is we'll watch that email address. And then anything that comes in to that inbox, we'll take the attached invoices and bring those documents directly into our system. There are other methods, of course. You can drag and drop. If you do have to go to a vendor website, for example, and download an invoice, or any paper invoices, you can still scan those in and get those into TimberScan that way. But regardless of the method used, once that invoice is in TimberScan, everything runs through our OCR AI. So we're going to try to read the information that's on that invoice document and do some of the data entry for you. So when you arrive in this second step here, this is, you can think of as your first level pass at the invoice, a chance to see the invoice document. Most clients use dual monitors or just large screens where they can see that invoice document up on one screen, and right next to it they'll have the AP invoice entry grid with a lot of the fields already pre-filled based on what the system read off that invoice document itself. So it'll fill in things like invoice number, invoice date, dollar amount. We'll grab defaults from the Sage side as far as the accounting period, the vendor terms if they offer a discount, things like that. We'll fill in those fields accordingly from Sage. And then if you use the commitments in job cost and the vendor references that on their invoice, or even if they don't, you can do a lookup and select it for them. What we'll do there is grab the coding from that commitment, so you won't have to re-enter those committed lines, the job and the cost code associated with each. So if you had, say, 5 line items on that commitment and they all went to different cost codes, for example, we'll grab all that information, so you won't have to look up cost codes and things like that. It'll all come over, and then you just apply the invoice against that commitment. If the invoice isn't related to a commitment, if it's an overhead expense account, for example, we can also grab the defaults from the Sage side. So if you use the default GL account, the default cost code, etc., we'll grab that and populate those fields. With, again, the goal just being we're trying to reduce the amount of data entry you have to do, so it's more review and approval at this point. All right, so main step in item 2 here, fill in any blanks, double check the invoice document to make sure the vendor billed you the wrong amount. What we pre-fill are just default, so if the vendor billed you tax and they shouldn't have, you can just go ahead and change the amount, make whatever changes you needed, and then save it. And then that will trigger it to go into a workflow. So the workflows are optional, but most of our clients will use them in that they want somebody to look at those invoices, especially if they're material invoices and the material is shipped to the job site, they don't know if those those goods have been received, so they'll send it to a PM on the project or superintendent to just verify that that invoice is good. All right, the approvers in this third step, if you give them security rights, and you can decide on a user by user basis who can make changes and who can't. Anyone that has security rights to make changes, they can do that right then and there during that approval step. Otherwise, you give that user read-only rights, and they can see where things are charged, but they couldn't make changes. They'd have to put a note on the invoice, and then it would go to the next person in the workflow, and maybe they could make that change. They would see the note the user put on there, and maybe they're allowed to make the change that they requested. So the invoice goes through that approval process until it hits the last person in the workflow. We just call that person the final reviewer. It could be the project manager themselves. You don't need to use this final review step, but more often than not, we do have clients identifying final reviewers, which are typically people in the office, whether they're accounting or admin. They just want to see the invoices after they come back from the approvers. And it's when this person approves the invoice, well, that set it up to go over to Sage 300 CRE at that point. All right, so step 5, that's the end of the invoice flow. The payment flow, I'll go through that. But just a little preview. You select invoices for payment in Sage. Those would come back into TimberScan, and then similar to approving invoices, you can review and approve payments. All right, so I will break out of this and go into the live demonstration. So as I mentioned in the beginning, the TimberScan product's been around for almost 20 years now. So what you're looking at here, this is our original interface. It's in use by many of our clients. As you can imagine, they've been on TimberScan for as long as they've been on Sage 300 CRE. So we have customers, 15, 20 years. This is how they started using TimberScan. They still use it today. That being said, we also have a web-based interface. So if you prefer to work in a browser, whether it's Chrome or Internet Explorer, Edge, you can certainly do that. Both interfaces are available. So if you preferred, for example, to do invoice entry in the browser, you can certainly do that. You can use a combination of both. We do have a lot of clients do that, where maybe when they're in the office, they work with TimberScan this way, and maybe if they have to work at home or they're on the road, they might use the web-based interface. All right, I'll go through both. I'll use a combination so you can see how each of these behaves. I spoke about acquiring invoices via email. So a lot of the setup happens when the technical staff at Avid installs TimberScan. If you do have Sage installed in your office, we would do the same with TimberScan. We would install that on a server in your office. So all the documents would be stored on that server as well. Everything would be inside your firewall. If you do have Sage 300 hosted in a data center, then that's where TimberScan would be installed as well. And as part of that, we'll connect it to your Sage 300 database. And at that point, once that connection happens, data flows back and forth between the two systems. Right, this is the email setup where normally you'd have a line item like this one after that text setup is done. This is where you would tell the system, this is my AP invoice email address that I've given to the vendors and subs. So this is the one that we'll watch. Anything that hits that address, we take the attachments, we'll bring those documents directly into TimberScan. You still have this acquire step if you do need to drag and drop or scan in invoices. Again, you can scan those directly into the system. Either way, those invoices will be waiting for you in invoice entry, which is where I'm headed now. And I'll make a note here, the compliance warning, if you do use the compliance portion of Sage 300, and you get these type of notifications when you enter an invoice, like the vendor's insurance has expired, you're not going to lose that. You'll still get those notifications. when you enter the invoice here in TimberScan. Right, in this part of the screen, this is where you can see the invoice documents that have arrived. And then down here in the lower section, this is where the AP invoice entry grid and the data occurs. I'll mention, for me, I'm just on a 15-inch laptop here, so I have to scroll to see the whole document. But in practice, this is the piece I was trying to describe, where clients typically have large monitors or multiple, and they'll just have this AP invoice entry grid on a separate screen so they can see the full invoice document. If they had 10 different line items on the invoice, they could see that here and not have to do any of the scrolling here that you see I'm doing. It's just a function of my laptop. Worth mentioning, the layout of this entry grid will be identical to what you see in Sage 300. So not only do we grab the raw data from the Sage database, meaning your vendors, jobs, and cost codes, etc. We also grab the configuration. So however you have Sage set up, if you've told Sage you want to use the invoice code 1 field, for example, or the draw field, we're going to use that same configuration, lay out this entry grid, exactly the same columns in the same order that you have in Sage 300. So that, of course, just makes it a whole lot easier for clients to transition from entering the invoice in Sage to doing it in TimberScan. One of the differences, of course, you'll see this invoice has been pre-filled. So this is just an example of that OCR AI going through and reading the invoice number, the date, the dollar amount. This information it's grabbing from Sage. So as far as the discount, it would grab that from the vendor file in Sage, the default accounting period. Those items are pre-filled. This invoice here, I put the job number on here myself. I just did a lookup. If you know the job number, you can key that in, or you can hit the F4 key or hit the lookup button like I did. This is going to show all your jobs that are in your Sage database, and you can just go ahead and select it. You can leave the cost code blank. I do reference that just because we do have a lot of clients where when the invoice comes in, they might know the job number, but they don't know the cost code. They want the PM or whoever to put that on there. So you can leave that cost code blank. And when you hit accept here, that would put it into the workflow out to the approver. And then maybe that approver's responsibility would be to put the code on there for you. All right, I spoke about commitment. So if this invoice was commitment related, you can go ahead and apply that invoice to the commitment. If the commitment was referenced on the vendor's invoice, it would populate here. But if it wasn't, like my example, or they put the wrong one, you can also do a lookup. These are all the commitments that are in job cost in Sage for this vendor. I'll just select this first one. This is where I can now see the line items on that commitment. So my example here, I have 2. For each of those line items, I can see the value of each line item, any change orders, what's been invoiced to date, what's remaining. And at this point, if the vendor's just billing you for one of the line items, you can select the one they're billing you for. Or if you prefer, you can hit the button at the top and select all, and then that just pre-fills the distribution area here. So it brings over the job and the cost code from that commitment. I don't have to re-enter any of that. If you put the mouse on a certain field, and you can do this during approval as well. So if I hover the mouse on the cost code field, it'll let me see actual versus estimate at the code level or the category level. It's available in invoice entry. It's also available to the approvers, as I mentioned, and that can be useful information to make sure, to help the PM make sure, the invoice gets to the proper code. Over on the right, we'll show you the total committed amount. What's invoiced to date, so this is what's posted already in Sage 300 CRE. What's in process in TimberScan. And then if you're over invoiced like I am here, you'll see that amount in red. And then you can also tell TimberScan, in addition to this, that you'd like a warning to pop up here to let the user know, hey, the invoice has now exceeded the PO. You also have the option of having that warning be a hard stop, meaning that you can't proceed here. The invoice is greater than the PO. You either need to reduce the invoice amount or enter a change order in Sage. Right, number of buttons here. I won't have time to go through all of them. Button at the top to go ahead and attach pages. So if you did have maybe a purchase order document, for example, you can go ahead and touch on that and add a PO or whatever documents are related to that invoice. There's a history button here. When I click on that, that'll show me all the invoices that have come in from this one vendor. And it doesn't matter if the invoice was entered through TimberScan or not. This will show you the whole AP invoice history for this vendor. We do that for a couple reasons. We'll use this information to pick up duplicates. So if you've been on Sage, say for 10 years now, and you just started using TimberScan today, and a vendor emails you an invoice that you had already processed last month, for example, we'll pick that up as a duplicate and let you know about it. If the invoice was entered through TimberScan, then you'd be able to hit this view button. You could actually see that invoice document. And then if it did go out for approval, we'll insert what we call this approval page. So each of those steps I was describing in the opening, as far as when the invoice came in, who entered it, who approved it. If it went to multiple approvers, you would just see multiple approval boxes on this page. Who did the final review, and finally who posted those invoices in Sage. So you'll have that audit trail available to see everyone that touched that invoice along the way. And then when I X out of here, it brings me right back to where I was in TimberScan. All right, so first pass of the invoice, verify everything looks good, make changes to any of the fields you need, fill in any blanks, put it against a commitment, hit accept. At that point, that will put it into the workflow out for approval. You can use any of these fields here to trigger the workflow, whether it's the job number or the cost code. Maybe you have different approvers based on the cost code. This could go out to multiple approvers. You could do by vendor, any combination thereof. It can also be conditional on dollar amount. We do have a lot of clients that do that, where they'll say, well, I just need the PM to approve the invoice, for example, but maybe if it's over a certain dollar amount, they want someone else to look at it as well. So, however you want the system to work, whatever your business rules are, that's what you define in the workflow. So when you're in this step here, you don't have to think about any of that. You just hit accept. The invoice will go down the proper path at that point. All right, before I go to the approval, just wanted to talk about a few things. You will get some dashboards here that come with the system. These will break out the invoices in process by vendor, etc. I do see clients use this invoice status report quite a bit, so I just wanted to bring that up. So in my test area here, I have 71 invoices for 720,000 in total. If I drill into that, I can see the number of invoices and dollar amount that are out with each person. And then if the approval area is kind of the hang up, you can drill into that. And now I can see all the invoices that are out with my one approver here, Mike McGuire, my PM. I could see the date each invoice was assigned to that person, the description, the dollar amount, and the totals down here. So again, you'll have visibility to all the invoices that are in process in TimberScan, and you'll also be able to see the ones that are out for approval. I won't show you the setup, but you can create notifications as well. So those are basically reminder emails. So you could tell the system, hey, if an invoice sits with an approver for more than 5 days, for example, you want that approver to get an email reminder. And that email reminder will come automatically from TimberScan. It'll list the invoices that are beyond that 5-day threshold or whatever you set. And then you can have some boilerplate text in the email that directs that user to the approval portion of TimberScan to go ahead and get their invoices approved. So that's where I'll go now. I'll go into the web interface for that. Again, it's not just for approval. You can use it for invoice entry, acquiring documents, running reports, etc. But as far as approval, very straightforward by design. As an approver, I can see all the invoices that are with me. I'll get a thumbnail view of these invoices that are in my queue. And then when I click into one, I'll first see any notes that were made. So I didn't go through this in invoice entry, but if you made notes there, those will pop up for the user here so they can't miss them. There's also a log button. This will show me every user that touched this invoice before it arrived in my inbox. So this is especially helpful if you have multiple people in the workflow. I can see everyone that touched this invoice before it got into my queue. Right, invoice documents over on the left, there are annotation options, buttons up here if there's sticky notes or things you want to circle, etc. You can do that type of stuff. You can also do this in invoice entry as well. A plus button here to add pages. If you're using a mobile device, your phone or iPad, for example, during this approval step and you wanted to add a page, when you touch on that, that'll invoke the camera. And as a PM, for example, if I've received material in the field, I could just take a picture of the packing slip at that point. Or maybe I want to take a picture of the material itself because it arrived damaged or the sub hadn't cleaned up their area and I wanted to document that. Anything you take a picture of will automatically attach to the invoice record here. Over on the right, this is where the invoice was charged. And this is where the system will check security rights. So if I do have security rights, I will have these lookup buttons on the right, these green buttons. And this is where I could click on the cost code. What the system's doing now, it's fetching the cost codes from Sage 300, and it will return them to me here. So I can see all the ones that are for this job. And then right next to it, there's a tab for the standard, the global cost code list. So if I have security rights, I can change the code. If I don't, then these lookup buttons are grayed out. I could see where things were charged, but I couldn't make any changes. You do have that info button. This is, where I can touch on that. That'll view me, that'll let me see actual versus estimate at the, the cost code level or the category level. Action buttons here across the top, button to add notes, reject. If you do reject, we'll ask you, a couple things, who are you going to reject this to in the workflow? So my workflow is very basic. I just have one approver and one data entry person. So data entry is the only place I can go. But if you notice the reject button's grayed out, I can't proceed here. I do need to put in a certain amount of text here as to why I'm rejecting this invoice. And then when I go ahead and do that, the reject button becomes available. I can click reject. It'll come out of my queue, go to the user's queue I've chosen. And then when they open that invoice, they'll get a message that this invoice was rejected to you on this date by this person, for this reason. Right, if everything else looks okay, you hit the approve button. And again, this process continues until it hits the last person in the workflow. And then at that point, the invoices will be ready to go over to Sage 300. So just to touch on that real quick. The final review step, if you do use that, this is where people in the office can view the invoices after they come back from the approvers. So that's where I am now. If the approver made any notes, those would pop up for me here again, so I couldn't miss them. Very similar experience to invoice entry. It's really just a final look at the invoice, options to add additional pages if needed, make any changes down here. There is a hold in AP button. I'll just mention that as well. So if you do hit the hold in AP button, what that does is put the invoice on hold for payment reasons. So maybe you want to get it over to Sage to update your job cost in GL, but you want to put it on hold. You don't want to pay it yet, so you click that button there and that'll take care of it. You wouldn't be able to pay that invoice until you take it off of hold. right? If it looks okay, hit Q for export. And then at the, excuse me, end of the day, end of the month, however frequently you want to do this, hit this button here. This would send the 5 invoices that have gone through final review in my test area over to Sage 300 CRE. So I'll head just into my Sage test area real quick. When the invoices arrive from TimberScan, they come over as unposted. So I would just need to go in and post them here. If you do use the change posted invoice feature, so if you posted the invoice and you use this feature because you had to change something on that invoice after the fact, no worries, nothing you need to do on the TimberScan side. Any changes you make over here in Sage, we're going to pick those up automatically through that API connection. The other thing we'll do, as I mentioned, we'll store a copy of the invoice in the Sage database. So while you can always go to TimberScan to view your invoices, and that's certainly the place to go if you wanted to see all your invoices for a certain job, if I was in Sage and I was looking at the invoice register, which is where I'm headed now, and I was looking at a particular invoice, this one I've highlighted is just one I know I sent through from TimberScan a while ago. The paperclip icon is my access point to that document. I can click on that, and then while I'm in Sage, I could view that invoice document, without leaving Sage and having to go over to TimberScan. I could see it right here if I wanted to. And then finally, in Sage, when you log in, it'll ask you which data folder you want to access. If you do have multiple data folders, TimberScan will work the same way. It'll prompt you for the data folder, so you can use TimberScan with any and all of your Sage data folders. All right, I just mentioned looking at all the invoices for certain jobs. So, this is where you would do that with this inquiry, the job cost and invoice inquiry. So you can look at all your invoices for a job, but you've also got some filters here. So maybe you just wanted to see all your invoices for a certain project, but maybe just through a date range because you needed that billing backup for that cost plus or T&M job, et cetera. So you could do this for, the starting and ending invoice date, say for March, it would gather up all the invoices for that time frame. You can also do it by accounting date. If you prefer, you can grab them by fiscal period here as well. For today, I'm just going to hit all dates to make sure I have a good amount of data to show. So we'll present you with this screen that lists all the invoices that meet that selection criteria you entered on the previous screen. This is a chance just to review what came in. If you do need to have these for a certain draw number, you have that field here. Any of these columns up at the top, I can filter and sort by, and again, you can move columns around and get these in a specific order if you don't care. For my layout, you certainly have flexibility there. You can also remove invoices if this was for a billing backup, a monthly draw, and you didn't want to bill the customer for this particular invoice here for whatever reason. Just right click and hit the exclude button. That'll just take it off this listing. It doesn't delete it, it just removes it from this listing. And then as far as creating that draw report, I'll do that here. I'll tell the system I want to create the PDF. I'll just mention you do have a lot of choices here as far as other documents you may want to include. If you wanted to include the lien waiver or the approval page or supporting documents like the purchase order, things like that. Buttons here you can click to include or exclude any of those. Over here, I'm going to tell it I want a single report with a summary of the invoices and then the images behind it. You can group these by vendor, by cost code. We do see clients do that a bit. So, I'll group this by cost code and hit OK, and it would produce a report for me that looks, like this. So this is an example of that monthly billing backup report. I'm just making that a little bit bigger here. So this one I told to group by cost code. So it'll sort and subtotal by cost code. These are the invoices for this one project. And then the total here is 268,000. And then as I scroll, I can see all the invoices that make up that total. And at the bottom of each of these, since I told it I wanted the cost code, you know, it will stamp the cost code on each invoice record for me. All right, just a couple more things here, and then I'll pivot into the payment section. There's an accrual function that comes with TimberScan. I do like to mention that. So, you know, our clients, no matter how hard, you know, any contractor tries, they're always going to have some value of invoices in process at the end of the month. So we'll provide an accrual function to handle that for you. What that does is it creates reversing job cost journal entries in Sage for the value of the invoices that are in process in TimberScan at that point. So typically clients would run this the last day of the month, let TimberScan create the entries in Sage. At that point, they would go ahead and run their, you know, bonding report, WIP report, financials, etc. And then, as I mentioned, you know, normally have this box check to create the reversing entries into the next period. So you know, you don't have to worry about it doubling up when those invoices do get approved, of course. Okay. About 7 minutes left. I'm going to pivot into the payment solution. So the payment piece is also very straightforward. Just high-level overview of how that's going to work. You would use Sage 300 CRE to select your invoices for payment. So nothing's really changing on the Sage side. You're still going to go through your normal process of selecting invoices for payment. So you're in total control of what vendors you pay and when, of course. And then you would move that data over to TimberScan, and then you could have a workflow there as well for the payment side. So if you do have, maybe you're printing checks today and you require dual signatures if the check's over a certain dollar amount, you can certainly do that in TimberScan as well, as far as on the payment side, if you do need multiple people to approve payments over a certain dollar amount. Right, when you approve the payment, the money is then debited. You'll see a debit transaction hit your bank account, and then Avid will start the process of getting that vendor paid. We'll work with them directly, so you don't have to worry about that. If they're, excuse me, in network, we'll go ahead and pay them based on their payment preference. If they're new to the network, there's nothing you need to do. We'll reach out to them, let them know there's a payment headed their way from your company. Will take care of the onboarding. We do ask all the vendors in our network to verify they are who they say they are. We will require a W-9 to verify the EIN, match that up, you know, against our database. All right, the vendor choices, they can get a couple choices of electronic payment, they can get a virtual card, an ACH payment, or check payment. If vendors do prefer checks, certainly we'll print one out of one of our check printing facilities and just drop that in the mail for them. We do encourage electronic payment, of course, for a number of reasons. You don't have to worry about checks getting lost in the mail or fraud. And of course, it's much faster. All right, so that process, excuse me, you select invoices for payment in Sage, and you go ahead and you use the print check feature. And if you can see this okay, what's boxed in red here, it just says print to Avid printer. So what that's going to do is take all that information in a check run, and instead of sending it to a printer to print checks, it creates a file, which then comes back into TimberScan for someone to review and approve those payments. So that's where I am now. At this point, again, nothing has left your bank account. It's as if you've printed checks in Sage. Someone's gone through the process of paper clipping the invoices behind each check, and now you've got this stack of checks that's on someone's desk for signature. Electronic equivalent of that here. Nothing has left your bank account. A bunch of payments are queued up by a vendor. So this is what the payment approver, the check signers view, if you will, what they would see. So they'll see that there's a payment queued up here to go out to Kingston Plumbing for this 2155. They can see the invoices that are being paid. For me, it's just one. If there were multiple, I would just see those listed down the screen here. There is a button I can click to expand the details. So if as a payment approver, I wanted to see, hey, what job and cost code was this charged to? Well, I can just open that up and view that here. Because you use TimberScan, the user can see the invoice document. They can see the approval page. If I did want to, as part of my payment approval, I needed to see who approved this. Well, I have that right here at my fingertips. And then when this looks okay and the user says, yeah, let's go ahead and get Kingston paid this 2155, that's when you hit the approve button. Behind this, there is a portal that communicates with the AvidXchange payments team. This will let them know you've authorized a payment to Kingston Plumbing for 2155. So it's at this point you would see this 2155 debit transaction hit your bank account, and then Avid would start the process of paying that vendor. So that process is here. We have over 1.2 million suppliers in our network today. And again, if that vendor is one of those, we know how they want to get paid. We keep a profile on each of the vendors in network, and we'll just relay payment to them accordingly. It is a two-sided network, meaning that the suppliers will have access to a portal as well. So they could see payments in process to them, not only from your company, but any of their other customers that might be paying them through AvidPay. If they have questions, they can ping us in the chat line. They can use the support center at AvidXchange as well for payment inquiries. I'm sure certainly they'll still reach out to you. It should cut down on the number of collection calls you have, but there is an inquiry in TimberScan here where you can look up the payment as well. So you can go into the payment inquiry and see details on when those payments were processed. So, if I just did a search here, and you can do these by bank account, by vendor, etc. But this is where you could see those details as far as, how the vendor was paid, when that process started, etc. The other thing we will do is we will attach back a proof of payment document. So just to show you an example of that here, when the vendor is paid, they'll get a proof of payment document attached back to the invoice record. So this is an example of a vendor that was paid via virtual card. So this will happen automatically. If they were paid via check, you would see a copy of the canceled check here. If they were paid electronically, that's when you would see that proof of payment document. All right, and I'll just mention here, one of the things we do when we first contact new vendors to enroll them, we certainly don't want to hold up their payment process. So we will give it 24 hours. If we can't get a hold of the vendor within that time frame, we're just going to print a check for them, and then we'll follow up going forward to see if they wanted to change their payment method. All right, this is that payment inquiry I was speaking about, probably a better example here, so you can see, when that check was cut. This same information, again, will be available to the vendors on the portal, so they could see when the check was cut and when it was issued to the supplier. So those details here, but you'll have access to it as well if they don't use the portal or if they contact you directly. And again, this is a sample of the proof of payment document. All right, so 1145, in summary here, why AvidXchange? We have a complete end-to-end AP automation solution. You can process your invoices from anywhere, access TimberScan. As long as you have an internet connection, you can use the TimberScan product wherever you are. Capture invoices via email, OCR, AI, all part of the product included in the initial cost. And the embedded vendor pay solution is there. We also have a credit card solution. So if you do have employees with company cards, we have a solution for that as well, where they could use an app, take a picture of the receipt. It'll get transmitted back to an area where you can see all the receipts that have come in, match those up to the items on the credit card statement, reconcile, and then those would get passed into TimberScan where they could go out for approval or bypass approval, and they would just go into Sage 300 at that point, where you would select invoices to pay to go ahead and get the credit card bank paid. And then finally, we have a lien waiver management solution, works with DocuSign. So if you do need to get lien waivers out to your subcontractors, you can do that through TimberScan, and the vendor or the sub will receive a DocuSign with that lien waiver for them to sign. And when they do that, that'll come back into TimberScan and gets auto attached to the invoice record as well. So you'd see the invoice, any supporting documents, the approval page, the lien waiver, the signed lien waiver, as well as the proof of payment document. So a complete end-to-end solution. All right, I will stop there. I appreciate everybody's time this morning. Of course, certainly if you have questions, feel free to contact your Ethos representative, or you'd like a live demonstration of the TimberScan product, they can get that scheduled for you.